Saint Roch was born around the year 1295 in the city of Montpellier, in the south of France, into a noble and deeply Christian family. His parents, John and Liberia, were known not only for their wealth, but also for their charity and devotion to the church. From his birth, Roch's life already bore a divine sign, a cross-shaped mark on his chest, interpreted by many as a sign of predestination to holiness. His parents considered that mark a special blessing and promised to raise him in the fear and love of God. Montpellier at that time was an important commercial and cultural center. The city attracted travelers from various regions of Europe, and living alongside different peoples and customs shaped Roch's formation. Despite having access to the wealth and comfort of noble life, he grew up with a heart detached from material goods. From an early age, he frequented the church, participated in masses, and sought to serve the poorest, accompanying his mother in works of charity. When Roch was about 20 years old, his parents passed away, leaving him a considerable inheritance. This moment was decisive in his life. Instead of managing the property and pursuing a political or military career, as was common for young nobles, he decided to renounce everything. Inspired by the example of Christ and the teachings of the gospel, he distributed part of his goods to the poor and sold the rest to finance a pilgrimage to Rome. His decision caused astonishment among acquaintances and even among some relatives, who did not understand why such a promising young man would abandon comfort to live as a pilgrim. Nevertheless, Roch felt within himself a profound calling that he could not ignore. He believed that God wanted him free of all attachments so that he could serve entirely his will. Roch set out, dressed in the simple garb of a pilgrim, a rustic cloak, a broad-brimmed hat to protect him from sun and rain, and a staff to support him on long walks. On his chest, he bore the sign of the cross, not only marked on his skin from birth, but also worn proudly on a small crucifix around his neck. The journey to Rome was not only a geographical one, but also a spiritual one. Roch took advantage of each stop to pray in small chapels and churches, asking God to show him his mission clearly. He believed that the pilgrimage would be a means of purifying the soul and a path to discerning how he could best serve his neighbor. Along the way, Roch began to encounter the signs of the plague, a terrible epidemic that ravaged Europe in that century. Entire cities were under quarantine, and many avoided contact with the sick for fear of contagion. But Roch did not keep his distance. On the contrary, he drew near to the sick, offering them water, food, and above all, spiritual consolation. In several villages, he spent days caring for abandoned patients, washing wounds and praying with them. He had no medical training, but his zeal and compassion made a great difference for those on the brink of death. He believed that the greatest healing he could offer was that of the soul, preparing them to meet God. Many began to see in him a sign of the divine presence. There were reports that after his prayers and care, some patients showed sudden improvement. Roch, however, refused any personal glory, attributing all merit to God and encouraging those healed to give thanks to the Lord. Upon arriving in Rome, Roch found the city on high alert because of the plague. Makeshift hospitals were overcrowded, and even members of the nobility had been struck. He volunteered to serve in the hospitals, where he spent most of his time caring for the poorest and most marginalized. His presence was comforting to the sick. Roch showed no fear of contracting the disease, and many testified that his mere presence conveyed peace and hope. He prayed at their bedsides, held the hands of the dying, and was often the last friendly voice those people heard before passing away. In Rome, Roch became known not only among the people, but also among the clergy. Some priests saw in him a living example of Christian charity and humility. His fame spread, and many began to seek him out to ask for prayers or spiritual counsel. Despite exhaustion and the constant risk of contagion, Roch persevered in his mission. He believed that God had led him there to be an instrument of mercy, and he did not allow fear or fatigue to keep him away from those in need. During his service, Roch witnessed not only the physical suffering, but also the spiritual loneliness of the sick. Many felt abandoned by their families and even by God. He therefore devoted long hours to listening and dialogue, helping them to be reconciled with the faith. On some occasions, Roch was seen at dawn praying alone in the hospital chapel, asking for strength to continue. Those silent prayers were his spiritual fuel, for he knew that by himself he would not have the strength to endure the harshness of that mission. Little by little, Roch began to realize that his work was not limited to the physical and spiritual care of the sick. His very life was becoming a witness, inspiring others to serve and to face the plague with courage and faith. News of his dedication reached the Pope, who, impressed, sent him a special blessing. Roch, however, remained humble, refusing honors and continuing his work as if he were just another volunteer. After a few years serving in Rome, Roch decided to return to France. On the way, however, he continued to devote himself to the sick in the cities he passed through, facing new waves of the plague that arose in different regions. In Piacenza, in Italy, the situation was especially grave. Hospitals and streets were filled with the sick, and many bodies had not even a dignified burial. Roch, as always, threw himself into service, helping to bury the dead and care for the living. It was there that, exhausted and weakened, Roch contracted the plague. The disease manifested itself with high fever, pain, and sores across his body. Even so, he continued trying to help others until he could no longer stand. Fearing to infect other people, Roch withdrew to a small hut on the outskirts of the city. There, alone and debilitated, he prayed and offered himself to God, accepting his suffering as a participation in the cross of Christ. Tradition relates that at that moment of solitude, God sent him help in an unexpected way. A dog belonging to a local noble began to visit him every day, bringing him bread in its mouth and licking his wounds, as if to relieve his pain. This dog became an inseparable symbol of the iconography of Saint Roch. The animal not only fed the saint, but also brought water from a nearby stream, helping him to survive in isolation. The dog's owner, intrigued by the animal's behavior, followed it one day and found Roch debilitated. Impressed by his faith and patience, the noble began to care for him until he regained his strength. This episode would deeply mark the story of Saint Roch, showing that even in moments of greatest suffering, God can send help from where it is least expected. For Roch, that period of illness and isolation was a true school of humility and abandonment to divine providence. After miraculously recovering from the plague with the providential help of the dog and of the noble who took him in, Saint Roch resumed his pilgrimage, always ready to help the sick and the needy. His health, though fragile, did not prevent him from serving. He believed that as long as he had strength, he should continue his mission of consolation and healing, for he saw in it the fulfillment of the calling he had received from God since his youth. Crossing various cities once again, Roch witnessed the destruction the plague left in its wake. Entire villages were abandoned, and many families fell apart in the face of death and poverty. He did not limit himself to caring only for bodies, but also comforted downcast hearts, exhorting everyone to trust in God's mercy even in the darkest hours. Determined to return to France, Roch entered regions that were in a constant state of alert due to military conflicts. His simple pilgrim's appearance aroused suspicion in some local guards who believed him to be a disguised spy. Because he did not wish to reveal his true identity, out of humility and also not to desire any privilege, he ended up being unjustly imprisoned. In prison, Roch was placed in a small, damp cell, not knowing when or whether he would be freed. Life there was hard, with little food and constant cold. Nevertheless, he did not rebel or seek to accuse his captors. On the contrary, he accepted that situation as a new trial sent by God, offering his suffering for the conversion of sinners and for the relief of the souls in purgatory. The other prisoners, perceiving his patience and serenity, began to approach him in search of words of comfort. Even incarcerated, Roch continued his spiritual mission. He prayed with them, counseled them, and encouraged them to repent of their sins. His cell, which had once been a place of silence and despair, became a space of prayer and hope. Even without freedom, Roch felt that he was exactly where God wanted him to be. For him, the place or condition did not matter, but fidelity to the gospel did. That awareness gave him peace and strength to endure humiliations and privations. Many times he spent whole nights in prayer, asking for the health of the sick and for peace in lands marked by war and plague. The prison guards found that man's conduct strange. There were no signs of revolt or hatred in him, only humility and gratitude for small things, like a piece of bread or a ray of sun that entered through the narrow window of the cell. Some guards, moved by his example, began to treat the prisoners more humanely, influenced by Roch's kindness. With the passing of time, his health again weakened. The unsanitary conditions of the prison aggravated old wounds, and fever began to consume his strength. Even debilitated, he remained smiling and confident in God's providence. His cellmates saw in him a true saint, someone who lived to the full the faith he professed. Roch spent about 5 years imprisoned without ever revealing his name. This attitude, beyond protecting his humility, prevented his family or acquaintances from intervening to free him, which he considered contrary to the divine will. His only concern was to prepare for the definitive encounter with God, living each day as an offering of love. As death drew near, he intensified his prayers and offered each suffering for the salvation of souls. Physical pains, cold and hunger were borne with resignation, for he united them to the passion of Christ, seeing in them an opportunity to participate in the redemptive mystery of the cross. One night, perceiving that his end was near, Roch asked for a priest to hear his confession and administer the Eucharist to him. The priest, impressed by the holiness of that unknown prisoner, granted the request and spent hours listening to his last words and prayers. After receiving the viaticum, Roch remained in deep recollection, praying until he fell serenely asleep. The next day, the guards found him lifeless, with a serene face and a slight smile, as if he had seen something extraordinary before departing. When they searched his belongings, they found a small crucifix and a parchment revealing his identity. He was Roch, son of John and Liberia, a nobleman of Montpellier who had renounced everything to serve the poor and the sick. The revelation caused commotion. Many remembered the fame of that devout young man who had helped so many during the plague. The authorities, repentant for the injustice committed, provided a dignified burial and spread the news of his holiness. The story of his life began to be told from city to city, inspiring new gestures of charity and faith. The people began to invoke Saint Roch as a protector against epidemics, recalling his courage and dedication to the sick. His tomb became a place of pilgrimage, and many claimed to receive graces through his intercession. The devotion grew rapidly, crossing borders and reaching various regions of Europe. Over time, the Church officially recognized His holiness, including him in the liturgical calendar as a model of Christian charity. His life, marked by renunciation, compassion, and total surrender to God, became an example for all the faithful, especially in times of suffering and illness. Saint Roch is remembered not only as a powerful intercessor, but also as a brother who knew human pain and did not turn away from it. His story teaches that true greatness lies in humble service and in love without reserve, even in the face of the greatest adversities. To this day, in artistic representations, he appears dressed as a pilgrim with staff, hat, and the wound on his leg, always accompanied by the faithful dog that brought him bread. These symbols recall his itinerant life, his suffering accepted in faith, and the divine providence that never abandoned him. Devotion to Saint Roch has spanned the centuries, and his name continues to be invoked in moments of health crises, reaffirming trust in the intercession of the saints. He remains a testimony that at any time or place, charity is the greatest expression of the Christian faith. After his death, the fame of Saint Roch's holiness quickly spread through Montpellier and all of France. The people, who had already witnessed his courage during the epidemics, came to see him as a special intercessor before God. His tomb became a constant point of pilgrimage, with the faithful traveling from afar to pray, give thanks for healings received, and ask for protection against contagious diseases. Reports of miracles began to multiply. The sick who touched his tomb or prayed asking for his intercession were cured of incurable illnesses. Entire families bore witness to graces obtained, and the stories spread quickly, strengthening popular devotion even more. Many of these healings were recorded by clerics and came to be part of the oral tradition passed down from generation to generation. Over time, devotion to Saint Roch crossed borders, reaching Italy, Spain, and Portugal. In these regions, his feast began to be celebrated with processions, solemn masses, and acts of charity in memory of his life. Churches and chapels were built in his honor, and his image became a common presence on altars, portrayed as a pilgrim with a hat, the wound on his leg, and the faithful dog at his side. One of the most remembered miracles occurred during a new epidemic that struck Venice. The residents, recalling Saint Roch's fame as a protector against the plague, organized a great procession, carrying his image through the city's streets. A few days later, the cases began to diminish, and many attributed the grace to the saint's intercession. In France, especially in Montpellier, his memory was preserved with great affection. The city, proud of its illustrious son, promoted annual celebrations that attracted pilgrims from all over Europe. On those occasions, besides liturgical celebrations, works of mercy were carried out, distributing food and clothing to the poor in honor of the example of charity left by Saint Roch. In Portugal and in Brazil, devotion to Saint Roch took firm root through the colonizers. In Brazilian territory, his image was enthroned in various churches and chapels, especially in regions affected by outbreaks of yellow fever and smallpox. The people, fearing new epidemics, trusted in the saint's protection and organized novenas and vows to obtain his help. In the Brazilian countryside, it became common to hold feasts in his honor, which mixed religious and cultural elements. In addition to masses and processions, there were also shared meals, traditional dances, and community gatherings. These celebrations were seen as moments of unity and hope, strengthening the faith of rural communities. The iconography of Saint Roch became universal. His figure as a pilgrim symbolized not only the physical journey, but also the spiritual walk toward God. The wound on his leg recalled his own experience with illness, while the dog represented fidelity and divine providence. These elements help the faithful identify with his story and recognize in him a close spiritual friend. In times of great epidemics in history, such as the bubonic plague in the Middle Ages or later outbreaks, Saint Roch was invoked as defender and consoler. His name was present in family prayers, in priests' sermons, and even in the decisions of civil authorities who asked for his protection over the cities. The Catholic Church, recognizing the devotion and the miracles attributed to Saint Roch, included his feast in the liturgical calendar, setting it on August 16th. On that day, in various parts of the world, his memory is celebrated with special fervor, recalling not only the protector against diseases, but the man of faith who gave himself out of love for his neighbor. The miracles attributed to his intercession were not limited to physical cures. Many bore witness to conversions of life, family reconciliations, and deliverance from vices. For the people, Saint Roch was a sign that God draws near in the hours of greatest need, acting through his saints to console and to save. With the passing of the centuries, his devotion remained alive, resisting cultural and historical changes. Even in times of lesser religiosity, Saint Roch continued to be remembered as protector of communities, and his feast retained the power to gather the faithful and renew hope. During the COVID-19 pandemic in the 21st century, many Catholics rediscovered the figure of Saint Roch and turned to him in prayer. Virtual novenas, online masses, and adapted celebrations showed that even in the face of new challenges, devotion to the saint remained current and relevant. The expansion of his devotion over the centuries is proof that holiness is not limited by time or space. Saint Roch, a simple and detached man, became an example of universal love, capable of inspiring people from different cultures, languages, and social realities. In various dioceses around the world, there are confraternities dedicated to keeping his memory alive, promoting works of charity, assistance to the sick, and support for needy communities. These initiatives not only preserve his devotion, but also perpetuate his legacy of service and compassion. The story of Saint Roch continues to be told in books, sermons, and catechesis, inspiring new generations. His life is presented as a clear example that true greatness lies in serving, and that the path of holiness is built in the small and great choices of love for one's neighbor. The witness of Saint Roch reminds Christians that faith is not lived in isolation, but in communion with others, especially with those who suffer most. His memory is an invitation to look upon the world with compassion and to act concretely on behalf of the needy. Thus, Saint Roch remains not only as a historical figure or a devotional character, but as a friend and intercessor who walks alongside the faithful in every age. His life and his miracles show that holiness is accessible to all who are willing to live the gospel with radicality and love. The life of Saint Roch bears a profound message of detachment, service, and absolute trust in divine providence. He who was born in a noble cradle and could have enjoyed a comfortable life chose to renounce everything to follow Christ in a radical way. His choice for poverty and service to the sick was not the result of a passing impulse, but of sincere discernment and total surrender to God's call. His example teaches that true greatness is not in the possession of riches or in human recognition, but in the capacity to place one's own life at the service of others. Saint Roch spared no effort to help those who suffered, even knowing that this put his own health at risk. Such courage is born of a solid faith, capable of seeing in every sick person the living image of Christ. The period in which he contracted the plague and lived isolated in a hut is also a lesson in humility and patience. In that time of pain and solitude, he experienced in a concrete way God's care, who sent him help through a simple dog. That detail, so present in his iconography, recalls that divine providence can manifest itself in the most unexpected ways. His unjust imprisonment and his silence about his true identity reveal a rare virtue, the humility that does not seek to justify itself or to defend itself at any cost. Saint Roch accepted injustice with serenity, offering that suffering as a sacrifice for the salvation of souls. This attitude is an invitation that, in the face of offenses or persecutions, the Christian keep the heart united to Christ and avoid resentment. In the symbolism of Saint Roch, each element speaks deeply to the faith. The pilgrim's staff represents life's journey in which the Christian must always advance toward the heavenly homeland. The wide-brimmed hat recalls divine protection over those who trust in the Lord. The wound on his leg is a sign of his participation in the suffering of the sick, and the dog with bread in its mouth is a reminder of the providence that never abandons those who serve with love. In the context of the Church, Saint Roch is seen as a model layman who, without being a priest or a consecrated religious, lived the radicalism of the gospel. He recalls that all the baptized are called to holiness and can, in their state of life, be instruments of God to bring healing and hope to others. His life is a testimony that it is not necessary to have great influence or titles to transform the world. One need only love without measure. Devotion to Saint Roch also has a deeply communal character. Over the centuries, he has been invoked in times of health crises, bringing entire communities together in prayer and solidarity. This communal dimension of faith is essential to the Church, for it strengthens fraternal bonds and encourages the concrete practice of charity. For our times, Saint Roch's message is especially relevant. We live in a world marked by new forms of suffering, whether from illness, isolation, poverty, or moral crises. The example of the saint invites every Christian to be a presence of mercy, to draw near to those who suffer, and to offer not only material assistance, but also spiritual and human support. His witness also recalls the importance of trust in God. In every moment of his life, youth, illness, imprisonment, and even death, Saint Roch maintained the certainty that the Lord guided his story. That unshakable faith is a remedy against the anxiety and fear that so often paralyze people in the face of difficulties. To celebrate Saint Roch is not only to recall a figure of the past, but to renew a commitment to an authentic Christian life. It is to let oneself be inspired by his zeal and by his surrender, seeking to live each day as an opportunity to serve and to love. His memory is a call to conversion, so that we may set aside selfishness and become more sensitive to others' needs. In parishes and communities that have him as patron, Saint Roch is remembered not only in processions and feasts, but also in ongoing works of charity. These initiatives keep the essence of his mission alive, transforming devotion into concrete action and causing his spiritual legacy to continue bearing fruit. The legacy of Saint Roch is also a reminder that holiness is built in daily fidelity. It is not a matter of grand, isolated acts, but of an entire life shaped by grace and love of neighbor. He shows that every gesture of kindness, every renunciation out of love, and every prayer made with sincerity has eternal value. In popular imagination, Saint Roch remains the saint of the plague and the protector of the sick. But for those who delve deeply into his story, he is much more. He is the brother who drew near, the faithful friend in hours of trial, and the model disciple who follows Christ without reserve. He is the one who, with simplicity, translated the gospel into concrete works. Thus, when we invoke Saint Roch, we do not ask only for his intercession to ward off diseases and dangers, but also for his help to live as he lived, with faith, courage, and boundless love. May his life continue to inspire men and women to be signs of hope in the world, especially where there is pain and abandonment. In the heart of the Church, Saint Roch is a beacon pointing out the path of charity and trust. His story reminds us that God makes use of those who place themselves totally in his hands, and that no life is too small to be an instrument of great works. As a pilgrim of faith, he invites us to walk with perseverance until the day when, like him, we may rest in the presence of the Lord.